Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Greg Weimer. I'm Director of International Students and Scholars here on campus, and today we are bringing you a session entitled Cultural Competency Training. And the two folks that are actually going to be presenting are both Emily Ambrose and Susan Hua. And we are excited for them to share their expertise. I will say if you have any questions, you can always raise your hands and we can unmute you as their opportunities arise. Currently, ladies, we have 11 in attendance, so we actually have a pretty decent attendance today, which is exciting. So, and then the webinar chat should be open, so if you have questions, feel free to put your questions in the chat as well. And so with that, Emily and Susan, I will turn it over to you. Welcome.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're really excited to be here. My name is Susan Hua. I use she, her pronouns. I currently serve as the Executive Director for Inclusive Excellence, which is a really fancy way of saying that I do a lot of trainings and workshops and am responsible for educational opportunities with the Office for Inclusive Excellence. And I'm really excited to be joined today by Emily Ambrose, who will introduce herself.
My name is Emily. I am thrilled and honored to be presenting with Dr. Susan Hua. And I work in the Laurie Student Center in Training and Talent Development. And I'm really looking forward to today's presentation.
Awesome. Thank you. And then we just wanted to also mention that Sagarika Sarma, who folks may or may not know, is the Assistant Director of Student Case Management and Referral Coordination. And this presentation that we're about to give you is actually based off a lot of work that she has done. And so just wanted to give her an honoring and credit for her work.
Great. We're thrilled that so many of you have joined us. It looks like a few more have popped on as well. We will be utilizing the chat. So get ready to click links and go to some worksheets that we have prepared for you. If you're watching the recording afterwards, we'll ensure that those links are provided to you so you'll have access. But it definitely makes the content a little bit better when you can interact with it and really absorb it.
Perfect. And so our first order of business is to get to know you and who's in the space. And so we do have what is called a Mentimeter. And so this will be an online platform where you engage. We'll have you answer the questions of your area of study as well as where you call home. And if you'd like to share your pronouns, you're able to as well. And so Emily has shown on the screen our QR code. And so you'll scan the QR code or put www.menti.com into your web browser and enter the code that you see here, which is 8907-2139 to access the room.
We can see that 9 of you have accessed it so far. So when we get that number up just by a couple, then we'll go ahead and change the screen and ask that first question just to get a sense of who's in the room with us, where we're representing. Wonderful. Right. So this is going to generate a bit of a word cloud for us. So if you are on your smartphone or in your web browser, just type in wherever you call home. It gives us a sense of who's joining us. I was born and raised in Alaska, the 49th state of the United States of America. And so that's definitely a place I call home. Susan, where's a place you call home?
Yeah, I was born and raised in Massachusetts, which I think is one of the first states in the United States. And so on the East Coast. And so folks might know Boston. I'm about 2 hours away from that. And that's home for me.
So this is really great. We can see that we've got a variance of representation here. The larger the word, the more representation. So we see India and Iran are represented, as well as Mongolia, Indonesia, Shan State, Thailand, Mexico, Nepal, Bangkok, Burma. This is fantastic. Thank you. So we'll wait a few seconds and then go to the next one.
Oh, also seeing South Korea pop up. Amazing.
That's great. So what are our areas of study that we have represented with us as well? This kind of gives Susan and I an idea of how we gauge some of the conversations too. Great. Ooh, wonderful.
Oh, music choral conducting. That's really awesome and interesting. seeing some great computer science, economics, watershed science, impact MBA program, MCIS. Emily, do you know what MCIS stands for?
I was going to ask you the same thing. If
Okay.
if whoever did that wants to put the full acronym in it, or we could educate ourselves. I feel like there's a lot of opportunities that we'll have to say Google is a great educator
Yes.
if we can verify our sources, right? But we could definitely do that. That's wonderful. Okay.
It is a Master of Computer Information Systems. I
Oh,
did use Google,
look at that.
indeed.
We love it when there's two of us because we can bounce in that area. So welcome. We'll use Mentimeter a couple of different times during this presentation, and we wanted to keep names confidential since this is a recorded session, and we're so glad that you're here with us and participating in the ways that you are already. So I'm going to back here.
Awesome. And so you might be wondering why we're having this conversation. And it's really important to acknowledge that CSU is culturally diverse in many ways, as we know, and as we've just seen and witnessed on our Mentimeter. If we had more attendees, we likely would see a larger variety of different areas that folks are representing, both from origins of home as well as majors. And you also, as you've been experiencing the campus environment, whether that's virtual or in person, you might know that there are many folks who come to the CSU campus that are not just faculty, staff, and employees, but also community members, right? And so there is a lot of diversity at CSU. It's important to explore the applicability of considering culture to build trust among and within the community. And so when we understand how to work within different cultures, we're better able to communicate with more confidence and be able to build trust amongst our peers and our colleagues. It also informs the support that we extend to colleagues and students with cultural knowledge and awareness. And so Emily and I will talk through a couple of different, what we'll call cultural patterns or cultural dimensions with you today. And just having that awareness of how you're interacting will help you better support your friends and colleagues as you're embarking on your academic programs, because we'll have this awareness of how different cultures might place value and emphasis on different types of relationships. And lastly, as we communicate across cultural differences, we build our social and emotional intelligence and intercultural effectiveness. And so, from the majors that you all shared, these are all different areas where you might be working with folks from different backgrounds and having to build those relationships, perhaps internationally as well. And so these are skills that you'll carry on, not just at CSU, but in your career as well. And so, just to let you know what our journey is today, we will talk about what culture is and engage in some conversation there. Again, we'll talk about cultural patterns or dimensions, and then you'll get a chance to map out and reflect on your own personal cultural orientations. We'll leave you with some tips to work across different cultures, and then we'll have some time at the end for question and answer.
We want to start with this question, right? What is culture? When you think of the word culture, what comes to mind first? What are some of the components or culture? So again, if you popped out a Menti, go back in with that QR code, and then you'll find it. Words you associate with culture. So when we say culture, what do you think of? What are some of the components of it? What are some of the entities that you would use to describe culture to someone? Yes, we see traditions, food coming up. What else? Yes, how you greet people, some of those social norms of how you acknowledge, how you welcome, the language, the dresses, how you negotiate. Yep, with what communicative practice, if that's more direct or indirect, the food for sure, work ethic, what that entails, songs, traditions, behaviors, lifestyles, morale, conversational methods. You all have this. This is this is a very robust. Yes, Muhammad, thank you. So the instruction should be at the top again. Also, if you go to menti.com, you can use that code 89071239. So we see that it's a variety of different things, and we're going to tell you how we come to what the definition is that we use, right? So when we look at the definition of culture, we use Kluckhohn and Kluckhohn's definition, which looks at the sum total of shared values, beliefs, the meanings, the symbols, the attitudes, languages. You all nailed so many of these, right? Patterns of thought and behavior, emotional expressions, products, artifacts, the aesthetic standards, how things should look, our cultural norms around things, and styles of communication, all of which have been created by a group of people, which are transmitted, learned, and internalized. And here's the thing about culture, which Susan and I have talked a lot about. It becomes most present when you are out of your most familiar culture, right? Culture is kind of the water that's around you that you think is just normal until you go into another culture, right? Maybe this has been happening for some of you to really come to understand what some of those distinctions and differences are. And so many of you are experts in the room of the culture in which you come from, but then also are coming into and how to navigate some of that. So one of the one of the theories that we use is this idea of the iceberg model. Now it can be used in a variety of different ways, but the why we talk about the iceberg is because of the buoyancy, right? Well, I've got scientists in the room, so I'm going to curb my understanding a little bit. But essentially, when you look at the buoyancy of an iceberg, 90% is really going to be under the surface, and that 10% or so is going to be on top. That 10% that's visible are all of those visible things that you all noted: the dress, the food, the greetings, the language, all of those that you can consider and see around you as those symbols. The pieces that become really convoluted or complicated or difficult to navigate and understand is that 90% that's below the water. It's those patterns of thought, the ways that are appropriate to communicate, body language, conversational patterns, the ways that are okay to behave in certain spaces, all of those as a roadmap, if you don't have a cultural guide, can be really challenging. And so as we're navigating and negotiating how to come to understand, one of the aspects of the training are that we want to highlight what some of these different aspects of cultural patterns are and where you might find some of that bump up against or where some of those might be smoother.
So we wanted to start with this example of a possible element of culture. And so as you're looking at this backpack, so it's an image with three backpacks repeated, what comes to mind for you? And so I don't think we have a mentee for this, and so feel free to pop in the chat if there are words that you associate with a backpack. All right, seeing travel come through. Travel as well. If we had a Mentimeter word called travel would be pretty big right now.
Yep. You ready, Susan?
Any other words that might come to mind for folks? Okay, understanding, packing, being ready for a hike, adventure. Field visit, okay. Awesome. And so Emily has just switched us over to the next slide. And so there are many interpretations of what this backpack could mean. I think folks definitely signaled adventure, right? Going on a trip or traveling. But backpacks can also symbolize fear for folks, right? Especially if they might be leaving home or there's this sentiment of unknown. And then additionally, backpacks can also symbolize debt. And so individuals that might have to carry all of their belongings in a backpack with them, right? And so we have to understand that in different contexts, there might be different ways that we're interpreting perhaps the same idea or same concept, even though our framework that we're coming from is different.
It was too quick, sorry.
No, you're totally good. And so culture really seeks to answer a couple of different questions, right, as we navigate through understanding our relationship to culture. And so one example of this is what our relationship with nature is. And this can be the belief about the need or responsibility to control nature. I used to live in Honolulu, and something that I learned about was the concept of aloha aina, which is in Native Hawaiian talking about caring for the land. And so in Hawaiian culture, what I learned about there when I lived there was that there was a huge emphasis on the ways that we take care of the land because the land takes care of people, right? And so it definitely changed the ways that I looked at, when I'm at the beach or in different nature settings, how I'm treating the land in the space and ensuring that I don't leave behind trash or litter. And that has translated now to when I live here in Colorado, seeing the signs of pack in, pack out, right? And knowing that that's part of land conservation and seeing where that translates to different cultural values. So that's a really great example there of relationship to nature. Culture also answers a question of what our relationship is with other people. And we'll talk more about this as we talk about different cultural patterns, but there might be different familial relationships, different ways that we navigate social relationships, even business relationships, and that is informed by how we might have learned about these relationships within our cultures. It also answers the question of what human activities should be and how we're perhaps spending our time. And then, of course, relationship with time itself. And so the ways that the past, present, and future might inform and influence our decisions. And so, with that, cultural patterns and orientations include a culture's collective values, beliefs, practices, and other orientations, right? And so, a lot of the pieces that you all have named and already started talking about is, what creates and comprises a culture. These are pieces that might be systemic, repetitive, and habitual. And like Emily indicated, culture is kind of like the water that we exist around. And it's not until we're taken out of that space that we start to realize what is or isn't a cultural practice for ourselves and that we're observing in others. And so some things that you do that might be repetitive or habitual might not seem like a cultural practice, but it really could be. There's also broad patterns in culture as well, and it doesn't consider personal experiences or personalities. And so culture tends to be informed by groups and have existed over decades and decades of time, right? And are formed by so many different pieces of tradition, art, and culture. And again, those different pieces of the iceberg that Emily talked about. And this is different than stereotypes because stereotypes really lean into assumptions that we make based on perhaps one interaction of an individual and can be very negative, but these are not cultural practices. And so we just want to make that distinction for you that stereotypes and cultural patterns are very different. And stereotypes, while it may inform your interactions with others, are typically harmful, whereas cultural patterns are pieces that, again, come from a long history of tradition and ancestral practice that informs that culture and can be used as knowledge and not as a negative viewpoint of somebody else. I hope I captured all of that sentiment correctly.
I mean, if folks have questions, we won't necessarily read your name out, but if you have the question, other people have the question. So please feel free to use that chat to help us inform what we can talk about or expand upon more on if needed.
Oh, I was going to say,
so it's both of us. Look at
yes, it's both of us. So both of us. We don't have breakout rooms in the space, and so I think what we'll do is in the chat, if you wanted to share anything that you do in your life that is habitual and repetitive, and whether or not you consider that a practice or if you consider it cultural, that'd be great. And what Emily and I will do is read through the answers and kind of unpack that a little bit. An example of this might be, I was thinking about this as an example. I grew up taking off my shoes when I come in the house. And so I never wear shoes in the house, which I know is different than other folks in their cultures. And so I don't think I would have considered it cultural until probably later in life because it was just such a norm for me at home to take off my shoes. And so I would go to my friends' houses and realize that that was not a common practice, right? And so that might be one example. And I hope that folks can reflect on and bring forward other examples as well.
folks are thinking and putting into the chat. We'd love to hear a couple of them. And I just took a sip of coffee, right? And it made me think about how prolific, how expansive coffee as a drink, but the culture around coffee is in different countries around the world. And it being, along with tea, one of the oldest beverages that's been, taken in for thousands of years, and to see and note the different cultural considerations around it. Oh, we have some one. Yes, cafecito, having coffee or tea after dinner. Definitely cultural. Yeah, agreed. We also have a contribution if we're not sure about the other person's meaning and it might be impolite to ask, what should we do? That's a great question that we can maybe kind of work to address. And yeah, I mean, we could do it now or later. Drinking chai in every meeting or every evening. Yeah, that's a good one. Having rice each time I eat. So yeah, those consistent foods and what might be habitual or repetitive on that. That's wonderful. The question in the chat really had me getting to the concept of curiosity. And my hope is that what you will find, especially at CSU, in the guise of learning and in the guise of an opportunity for higher education, inviting it as that question. I'm always learning about the culture and I'm not sure I understood your meaning by that. Can you explain it to me? I feel if someone invited that question to me, that I would love to engage in that conversation. Susan, do you have a thought about the question that came through the chat?
Yeah. I definitely think you can just name that you don't understand, right? I'm wanting to make sure that I understood your meaning correctly. Can you please share more, right? And so it's not, I wouldn't say that it's impolite to ask. I think it depends on how you ask, right? But you can definitely share that you want to seek understanding and seek more, and that might help the person feel more open to sharing with you as well.
That extra add is that context. So it's the why. So as opposed to Susan saying something and you saying, what or what do you mean? You can say, I want to make sure I'm understanding. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? And that might be a higher context question or answer that gives a little bit more. And that's one of the patterns that we'll talk about as we go into the training with high context and low context. Oh, absolutely. I love that it came through. Dinner as a family is mandatory. This might be a family habit, but it also is a bit cultural. Agreed. And what and how those practices of eating and joining together, how long dinner is. My family dinners were 20 minutes and then you were up doing the dishes immediately, whereas some are expansive and over the course of many hours, right? Susan, what were some of your eating practices at home?
Yeah, I mean, I think that generally our eating practices were family dinners together, maybe a little bit longer than 20 minutes, but we would have family gatherings with the entire extended family, and we would eat for 3, 4 hours at a time. We would just sit there and it'd be a potluck. Everyone brings food, and we would just be together for a long time. And so those are definitely days that have long passed because our families are now so spread out, but some of my fondest memories of being with family.
I love what just came into the chat. So an addition, when someone comes to our home or apartment, even if he's visiting to fix the refrigerator, it's considered bad in our culture if he leaves and we don't offer something, specifically Pakistan or Pakistani culture. That's a fantastic addition and definitely something that I think is a cultural indicator. Thank you. That's great. So what these patterns and values reveal is a general orientation to life and work and relationships. It's really when you start considering it everywhere around us. We want you also to think about the relationships that are existing within you in the context of CSU, meaning that you might be a TA, you might be a faculty member, you might be a student who is wanting one of those roles. You might be navigating family within a new culture that you are in, or a multicultural family environment or friend group. All of those really compound, they really impact what types of relationships we navigate. It also reveals potential ideas or perceptions that individuals may have towards those with different cultural values. So at any point, I may have read something in the chat and been like, oh, that's different than what I might do. And that indicates that there might be a cultural difference. Now, we can get in trouble, or it can be notable if we're judging those cultural differences too harshly, or that's weird, or that's stupid, or it recognizes that there's just difference. And one of the things that Susan and I want to ensure that we communicate is different cultural patterns are just that. They might be different and have that opportunity to learn, and where we can track or pay attention to these perceptions that might come out, it might indicate where some of those cultural misses might be. They do not predict your ability to work effectively across culture, and that's really important. So someone who may come from a lower context culture can work very effectively with someone in a higher context culture. It takes awareness and skill to navigate, and so that's what we're going to be talking about today. Well, that's nice. So the nuance of cultural clusters and patterns and orientations, we want to make sure that we take a moment to say that people are more than their culture, right? If I were to look at Susan, and I would just think of her as what I might perceive her as, I might be limiting who she is as an individual person, right? Her experiences that she's had, the ways that she navigates the world, and where she comes from, all of that is it. The cultural patterns can be integrated also. So someone who comes from a low context culture with high power distance, that might integrate differently. Those words will come into focus and will come into understanding when we talk about them. They are dynamic and shifting all the time. So the US of today is different than the US of 20 years ago, which is different than the US of 100 years ago. So we know and recognize that cultures do shift and change, sometimes rapidly, but more so slowly. They can be contradictory sometimes and not make a lot of sense. All of this can be very convoluted and confusing, and there's beauty in the mess, right? There's beauty in the ability to ask questions and to invite understanding about each other's culture through building some of those relationships, which we hope you feel empowered to do. Um, the patterns and orientations may initially feel like stereotypes, right? So if I were to say all Latin people like spicy food, you're telling me that that's a pattern. That wouldn't be the whole story of it, right? It wouldn't be recognizing what farming patterns or spices are in that area, which influence the food, which then generate in the palate, right? So, and not all Latin people like spicy food. That would be a stereotype. And these orientations are a spectrum, right? And so when we invite you to consider these orientation patterns, we want you to know that it's not a dichotomy. It's not necessarily either or. There's going to be some countries or some organizations that are going to be very high in one, and then maybe kind of in the middle or really low. And all of that is okay. It's meant to complicate you a little bit, to ask some questions and critically think through some of these experiences. Susan, what would you add to either of those?
Yeah, I would say that as you're navigating different spaces and experiencing different cultural practices for the first time, or maybe you've been in different cultural contexts in different parts of your life, your own orientation in some of these different cultural patterns that we'll talk about might shift and change, or you might notice that in some spaces, your orientation will be different than in different spaces too. And so we'll give some examples of that, but I feel like when I'm with family at home, my context might change in some ways. And then when I'm at work, it changes in other ways. And so all of that says that you're able to then move fluidly and communicate from one situation to another because you have higher cultural context. And so we'll get into what those cultural patterns are. So I'm going to drop a link here that has a PDF. I hope that it looks weird, so let me know if it doesn't come through correctly. Because how odd that it comes out as this jumbled mess. It should open to a PDF of cultural patterns. Let me know if it does not, and I'm happy to troubleshoot and play with that a little bit.
It is there.
Okay, perfect. Wonderful, thank you. And so we will talk about 5 of the 8 cultural patterns. We also want to name that there are very many other cultural patterns that you might encounter and observe, especially if your curiosity is piqued by this and you do some research online, you might find many, many more different cultural patterns as well. These are the ones that we think are perhaps some of the more relevant as you're moving into different spaces with folks from different cultures, especially in a higher education context of perhaps new living situations, new relationships that you're building. And so these are the 5 that we'll focus on, but we can talk about others that are on the worksheet as well as many others as that might come up for you that you're observing over time. I'm seeing that there's an error to open the link, and so we will continue troubleshooting that space. Sometimes virtual things are not our friends.
Thank you for your patience.
Yes.
Susan, you've got this first one.
Yes.
So do you want to talk them through what they will see, and I will work on troubleshooting the link?
Yeah, absolutely. And so we will give examples of, both cultural patterns that are listed in terms of, this one being individualism versus collectivism. And so with that, Emily, I'm going to have you just click the content into being here. Thank you. Awesome. So the first one is individualism versus collectivism, and with that, individualism is ties between individuals are loose. Everyone is expected to look after themselves and their immediate family, versus collectivism is people from birth onwards are integrated into strong, cohesive in-groups, often extended families, which continue protecting them in exchange for unquestioning loyalty. And so, examples of this might be, families that might be more independent, where individuals are kind of more, spending time alone instead of together. Maybe immediate family households that just have the immediate family. And collectivism cultures are ones that have sometimes multi-family homes. And so I grew up in a household where for a short time our grandmother lived with us, and it was just a normal part of our living environment. So sometimes we see generational homes where it's grandparents, parents, sometimes extended family in those homes. And the ways that you orient in those spaces are being more, I would say, considerate of your family members in that space and spending time together as a whole unit versus individually. And so, a great example of this is that my partner is American. His family was born and raised in Florida. And I would say, when I think of traditional American, like his mom has known the Orlando, Florida area before Disney World was there. So she's been there for quite some time. And my family immigrated to the United States, I would say in the late 70s, early 80s. And again, like from a very collectivist culture, right? And so we were talking to his mom about, if she were to be ill one day, what would that happen in terms of us living far away in Colorado and not in Florida? And I said, well, if you were very ill, like we would likely just have you move in with us, right? Like that would just be a part of us taking care of you. And she said, absolutely not. Like, I would not move into your house, right? And she didn't mean that in a mean way, but I think that's just not the norm for how she would operate. And so it was, I think, strange for her to hear that she would just be invited to live with us in our home directly. And I just didn't think anything of it because that's the way that my family operates, right? And so, 2 examples of what individualism versus collectivism looks like. And Emily, I don't know if you have any examples of what that's looked like in your life at all, but just wanted to invite examples as well.
Yeah. So feel free to put them into the chat. What I think of is how sometimes this shows up at CSU. So for a variety of times, I'm the product of a fairly individualism culture. And so I would say a lot like, well, what do I want to do? And what do I want for my job? And I need to feel passionate about it. And I need to feel called. And so I might really gauge students in that conversation as well. Like, well, what do you want to do? And they're like, well, my parents really want me to be a doctor. I was like, yeah, but what do you want to do? And what I'm unintendedly doing in that is negating that the student that I'm talking to might be coming from a collectivist culture where the responsibility is shared and dispersed, as Susan was talking about, that we care for each other. And so the decisions that I'm making might not be only impacting me, but might be impacting the betterment of my entire family, extended family, my aunties, my tias, my uncles, who may or may not be the best friends of my parents, etc. Right? Whereas I think you look in different neighborhoods across the U.S., and some will be, single family homes on a cul-de-sac, which is a type of street where very few people know their neighbors, right? Like that's kind of an individualist representation of some of that. So those are some things that I'm thinking of, and we'd love to see them in the chat. I think we did get that link working, which is good. So I just want to highlight what our hope is for this worksheet. So Susan just did a great job of orienting us towards individualism and collectivism, right? If I were in here, and it looks like a variety of folks are, I would download it and click it and then open my very own. So this would be mine. We've made it a form for you. So I can type into here, and maybe I'm like, yep, I'm way over in individualism. Or I'm like, I'm not sure. I'm gonna press the space bar and recognize that I'm more in collectivism, that. So we want to invite you to use this form for your own reflection and consideration as we're talking through these 5 different components. Susan, any ads there?
Nope. I think that's great. Thanks for showing the example.
Of course.
All right, our next one is power distance. And so it's the degree of power difference that exists and is accepted. And so for a low power distance, power is shared and well dispersed, and society members view themselves as equals, versus a high power distance where a society or organization where there is an unequal distribution of power and people understand their place in the system. And so an example of this might be, if you are on a team and you all work collectively together to make decisions, or you have shared responsibilities. Perhaps not one person is in charge, but you say, you know what, at every meeting we'll rotate who takes meeting notes, right? Or who's in charge of running the meeting. So everyone plays a role in how that space operates. Whereas a high power distance might be an organization that you're a part of, or a team where there is one person who is in charge, and they might be the person who is creating the rules for the space. They might be less likely to engage feedback from individuals because they do have that power. And then your expectation would be to cater to their power, right? And so you're kind of doing things that they're telling you to do, or what their expectations are. And so that's where there's what we call unequal distribution of power, but it's because one person holds that power and they're very clearly in charge. And so we might see this in a number of different ways, right? How different classroom spaces are set up at CSU. Again, different teams, organizations, student organizations. Largely, we might see this politically, but also even within families too. There might be different ways that low power distance and high power distance might show up in spaces. And so, and again, invite you to, on your sheet, really reflect on and think about the context that you've experienced power distance in, or maybe perhaps where you prefer to operate from. And I'm going to open and invite any examples from folks if you want to share them in the chat as well.
Susan, I'm thinking about the first time that I moved from Alaska, which is a fairly informal, fairly easygoing culture, which I would say has a lower power distance. And I grew up being very comfortable with adults and believing that my voice mattered and it was heard and listened to, and I was an active participant at whatever age that I was. I moved to Northern Virginia, where it was my first interaction with a variety of different cultures that were different than mine in my neighborhood. And I met one of my neighbors who happened to be an Asian woman, and I learned her name and I called her by her first name, and she very quickly corrected me to share that it was considered impolite or disrespectful to not call her Mrs. So-and-so. And so I think that in those cultural patterns of how we greet each other, how we show or demonstrate respect, I had no ill intent to be disrespectful, and learning some of those cultural differences was really important into how I navigated a new space. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing.
I think what's interesting about this one too is as we were talking that they're interwoven at some points, you can sometimes see a correlation, right? A similarity between high power distance and collectivist cultures in terms of delineated or regimented roles and responsibilities within that, as well as who is able to define or create those roles and keep folks in order, right? So it's more orderly, maybe more structured, etc. Whereas there sometimes can be some confusion or role navigation or swapping of roles, which both of those have their joys and challenges, which is again why we're not here to say one is better or worse. They're just different. Because when there's low power distance, we can navigate and discuss and collaborate on like, well, Susan, do you want to do that this time? Do we want to do this? Susan has a role in the organization that is higher than mine, right? As a position, and the ways that we've operated, thanks to how she has navigated, is on a fairly low power distance because that's how I'm experiencing it, at least. So we have that collegial respect. But she, as the higher titled position, might set more of those cultural norms of how we interact together. So you get some of the like symptoms or like understanding of how that might be by looking to maybe those in power in your area, I think.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and I think that also sometimes the ways that you practice, right, is informed by other experiences that you might have had that then define your interactions. And so I grew up on the East Coast, which I think, as Emily shared, Virginia is also on the East Coast, and high power distance, I would say, is a thing there. And when I moved to the West Coast for school and then to Hawaii, I realized that there is a very different idea of power distance and the ways that people connect with each other in different spaces. And so I remember my first time going to a staff meeting as a professional in Hawaii, and because of the high power distance spaces I've been in, we'll talk about time as well, time relationships, but I got to the meeting 15 minutes early, was sitting there ready, and no one else was there. And I was like, why is no one in this meeting space right now? And as we got closer to meeting time, people started trickling in. And then we spent a good 10, 15 minutes, just what they call talk story, is just catching up and hearing about how people are doing more than just a how are you. We like talked about families, we talked about how like our communities, right? And that's how we spent the first 10 to 15 minutes of our time. And so I would say in that space the power distance was relatively low because it didn't matter who had a higher title in that space. We all collectively cared for each other, and that was odd to me as someone coming from a very high power distance relationship in previous professional roles. I was ready for someone to be in that space to tell me, what the agenda was for the day, how we were navigating the meeting, showing up on 15 minutes early because I was afraid of being late, right? And so just examples of that. And I think because of my experience in Hawaii, that's how I now navigate spaces with colleagues, is to demonstrate what I think is a level of care and collectivist culture and low power distance by inviting more collaboration, right? And so I think as you're making sense of your own experiences, you might see these different pieces shift and change for you, because there are times for high power distance and there are times for low power distance, and you might be able to control some of that.
I love learning new experiences about you, Susan, and so to know about our backgrounds, and that's great. I hope you all are having a good time reflecting on some of your experiences as we're talking through and saying like, oh, that might have been what's going on there, or oh, that's notable. We hope that for you. So I've referenced this pattern a couple of times, and so we're going to take a couple of minutes. And Susan, I might ask you also to consider coming in with your own examples of this. Sometimes I have a harder time describing or discussing it, and we're going to give it a go. So I love communication. I think that so much can be done through communication, and whoever put into the Mentimeter that cultural patterns around communications and how you greet people and how you negotiate, all of that very much exists. So When we're looking at context in communication and low context versus high context, we could also describe this as more direct and indirect also. I would say more so they can be synonymous, but we'll parse that out a little bit. Low context cultures really put an emphasis on the words, their straightforwardness and openness. They talk literally, they tend to be informal and efficient. So it might be, Susan, what do we have to do today? What are the tasks on the table? I'm understanding this. Is that when I'm going? All right, 5 minutes break. That might be low context, where as high context cultures rely on nonverbal cues and the total picture to communicate. Relationships and formality are valued and practiced. And so what that might look like is having more of a negotiation. Susan, I'm leaning and looking to you as someone to help inform me of what we might need to do. Well, I'm not sure if we need to do this. We could do this. In high context cultures, because you're looking at the history, posturing, the environment, different vocabulary, we have a colloquial saying here of reading between the lines. And when the idea of reading between the lines, so previously there were, well, not previously, it still exists, papers that have lines on it that you write on. And the words that are written in the lines, between the lines, is that context, right? So what is being said but not said? What's being communicated but maybe not? So if Susan asks me, hey, Emily, we really need to get that report done by Monday. And that's an indirect way of saying, hey, can you do that report over the weekend if it's Friday? And I might come back and say, my grandma's 75th birthday is on Saturday, so this weekend's going to be a little challenging. That's not me coming out and saying no, whereas low context or a direct communicator, Susan might say, can you get that? We have that expectation that the report is done by Monday. Can you get it done? And I might say, no. That would be low context. And in a high context culture or by like a communicator, that might be seen as rude or inconsiderate. Whereas folks who come from a low context culture could consider that efficient and helpful. And okay, Emily can't do it. I need to find another way. Whereas if someone in a low context is asking a direct question, but they get an indirect answer or a high context answer, they might be like, so can you do it or can't you do it? And it could be confusing. And because they're being asked to, quote, read between the lines, it can be this convoluted, wait, can you just tell me what you're saying? And so this is where some of those, they say 80% of conflict comes from missed communications. And I think a lot of it has to do with direct and indirect or low context and high context communication. Susan, what would you offer?
Yeah, I really appreciate that there's the history aspect of it, because what comes to mind for me is thinking about traditional spaces where there are a lot of oral histories, right? Because storytelling for a lot of different cultures has been the way to convey, practices, sometimes religion, sometimes uh, myths and
Lessons.
lessons, and yes, all of the beautiful pieces, right, of history. And so, it's interesting to think about the ways that storytelling might play a role in your family if you reflect on that, and the ways that it then translates into the ways that you might share narratives with other people. I am told by my partner all the time that when I tell a story, I give too many irrelevant details. But for me, I think every detail is so important, right? Down to perhaps what the person was wearing if I'm encountering an individual on the street, or, what they might be holding in their hand that is not actually relevant to the end of the story, but I put every single detail into my story. And it's because my family, I would say, is a family of storytellers. That's where they've had to share orally what our history has been over years. They were refugees from the Vietnam War, and that story has been passed along over time, right? And so I am used to very robust storytelling. That might not be a space where my partner is in, and so he's absolutely low context, and I can see where sometimes there's no patience for my high context storytelling. But it is really embedded into the ways that we practice oral histories within our families and what informs our knowledge. And so I just wanted to offer that as you reflect on ways that you might share about yourself or about stories that you might encounter on your daily basis.
I think about also cultures in the Native American or indigenous cultures and communities, of which I am not a part. And I've had the great honor to be in relationship with many who say so much without saying much at all. And so can have full conversations or communication or share understanding through a look or a gaze or a pointing of the lips in a direction, and storytelling being so important to there that lessons may come out without needing to say directly much of anything. Right. And so, but that nuance, that's going to take a long time. I mean, intercultural competence and understanding the nuances is a lifelong journey. And definitely Susan and I are still on that learning journey, along with having, some good experience as well. It looks like a question came in. Did you see that, Susan?
I did, yes. What's the difference between words and vocabulary? That's a great question. I'm going to offer my interpretation of what that is, and then I'll invite Emily to do the same. But when I think about words, I think about what Emily shared about the directness of conversations, right? Being very direct with how you're asking a question, or you're direct with your answer. So that straightforwardness. And so that could be a no, that can be a yes. Whereas vocabulary for me might be. Certain terminology that we use in different areas, right? I think for me in higher education, this is a great example of the ways that in higher education we have a lot of terminology that we use. Sometimes we say jargon, right? That we use in higher education. And depending on which offices you're in, or if you're in a professional role, you might hear a lot of different acronyms, right? Shorthand for things that we're working through. You might hear a lot of like common phrases for how we talk about data, how we talk about, student experiences. And those are all things that I would consider vocabulary and ways that we in higher education as professionals relate to one another and understand each other across different institutions, not just at CSU, right? But someone coming into that space who is maybe new to that professional space or might not be familiar with the terminology that we use, they might ask, well, what does that mean? How do you define student success, right? When we say that, I think there's a general understanding of how professionals in the space will interpret that, but someone new to that space might be like, well, I don't understand what that means at all. Can you share more, right? And so vocabulary might be very specific terms that you're used to using. And when you take yourself outside of that context, that might be when you realize that not everybody understands what that vocabulary means. And idioms are also a great example of this. I think that sometimes there are idioms that my partner will use that he grew up with, and I'm like, I don't know. Like a classic one I think I've heard in the US is that if you're faced with many choices, you can say that there's a bird in your hand in one hand and two in the bush. And one time someone shared that idiom with me as a way of saying that I had a lot of options. And I was like, I don't understand what's in the bush and what's in my hand. Like, what are we talking about here, right? But other people who might have the same vocabulary might be like, yeah, absolutely, you do have these two choices, right? So I've had to understand and learn idioms. And I think in every culture, there are idioms that you might use to describe different situations that feel natural to you in different settings. And it's about ways that you're able to explain that to other people who are not used to it.
That got me thinking about the definition of idiom. I was like, ooh, girl, you got me going back to sixth grade English class. I was like, what is the definition? Yeah, so those like colloquial sayings. I was thinking about when you were talking of which and how in the context of this image that we're looking at vocabulary. So I also think it can be which words are being used to convey the emotion or the circumstance that you're wanting. So an example that I thought of is sometimes in a an employee evaluation, right? Maybe you're a TA and your faculty member is giving you an evaluation, and they might give you praise or positive feedback, and then they might give you critical feedback. But maybe the critical feedback is opportunities for growth or developmental opportunities, or and what's happening is they're trying to soften it, or when folks who might be in a low context culture might say, these are just critiques, like this is just critical feedback, it's okay, I can take it, we move on, right? As opposed to, well, you have a lot of great areas and some opportunities for growth, right? So I think that's how it might mean the same thing, but how we come to understand it or how it lands on us. And when I say lands on us, I don't mean literally, I mean how it impacts us could be different based on the choice of words or the vocabulary used. I love that, two in the hand, one in a bush. Wait, one in the
I was
hand,
like, I
two
don't
in the bush.
understand what's in my hand, and is my hand in the bush? I don't
Yep.
know. So it was
Good
very
news.
confusing.
Good news, anyone on this training, you could Google it and you could be like, oh, now I understand, right? So Google, granted, check your sources, but
Yeah.
Google can be your best friend in helping understand some of this. Oh, I love talking about this one. So the next to last, right, the fourth one that we're talking about today is going to be an aspect of how we understand time or time orientation. You will find environments, maybe you come from environments where time is considered outside of oneself. And what I mean by that is it is something that exists. We talk about it like a noun, a thing that is outside ourselves and can be used. It can be scheduled. It can be wasted. It can be gifted. It can be utilized, right? All of these words internalize time as something outside yourself. And in cultures where there is more of a scheduled, fixed, linear, this training started promptly at 4 p.m. Our understanding of that, whereas military time here is on a 24-hour schedule that is linear in a 1 to 24. So it started at 1600 hours, which is really just 12 plus 4, but we say 4 p.m. here. And it will strictly end at 5:30 p.m. or 17:30, right? So it's this happens here, this happens here, this happens here. If Susan and I were late to this training, right? Maybe Susan started the training and I showed up 5 minutes late, and there could be folks in this room that would say, oh, that is rude. That was inconsiderate, right? We had a training, we had agreement. We don't want to, quote, waste people's time in terms of what they have generated to this. Whereas if I was the person who showed up 5 minutes late, it was because a student was in my office and we were having a really important conversation and we were engaging with one another, and time is fluid. And what really matters is the relationship and how I'm showing honor and respect to the person with whom I'm engaging. And because time is fluid, right? Some people might say in the afternoon. Well, does that mean 12:30? Does that mean 2:30? What does that mean? Someone from a more scheduled linear culture might ask that. Whereas if you're having a dinner party and it's like, come in the evening. Some people might show up at 6, some people might show up at 7, and all of that would be all right because it's fluid and relational, and you're engaging with each other, and it's more we exist in a holisticness of time, right? So this one can be a bit convoluted or confusing also, but hopefully some of the examples that are given in terms of, and why we wanted to highlight this one is also because this can be a cultural rub as well. So some of you who might be TAs in classes, class starts at this time, you don't accept people who are late or tardy, you will find that CSU tends to operate holistically on a very scheduled set time frame that's linear, whereas there might be other smaller organizations or office cultures that have the meeting start and have what, Susan, what was the words that you used? This
Talk story.
talk story, right? So that being yes, we know that content is going to start about the meeting a few minutes in, so we have the flexibility and fluidness to come into and out of. And those are all, and that will get into the tips, how you ask questions about that or how you understand or ask for some of that can be really helpful in bridging some of these cultural differences. Susan, what would you add?
Yeah, I think sometimes time when we think about cyclical time too can speak to where like ancestral honoring of time is, right? And
Mm.
thinking about sometimes there are cultures that have firm belief in things like reincarnation, right? And that informs how time is cyclical. And so that's another aspect that might come up in your families or in your relationships and how you view time from a perhaps spiritual lens versus not, right? And so just wanted to offer that as well as additional context for how time can show up in the cyclical or linear nature.
I love that. One of the concepts that is going to be on the handout that we'll share, but is not one that we'll talk about today, relates to this and what Susan just shared in terms of um, long-term or short-term orientation, right? So often the US tends to be a shorter term orientation of, well, don't waste the time that you have here on Earth. We only have one life to live, right? Whereas other entities, maybe native populations, will think of the 7 generations. So they're thinking 7 generations ahead and behind. I know Chinese culture is very oriented towards future and the next generations and legacy and lineage. So, and the reincarnation, all of that. So I would encourage you to think about that as another dynamic of time orientation. So, oh, just love talking about this.
All right, our last one that we're talking about today is thinking about private versus inclusive cultures. And so, whether or not your space is private or communal, right? An example of this might be spaces where, there's more closed doors, there's less community space or time spent together, versus an inclusive space or communal space is, more space where everyone gathers together in one place, and perhaps there's less closed doors, right, or less barriers to access in these community spaces. Um, I think of my family a lot. Sometimes when I go on vacation with my family or I am at home, visiting home with family, we are together all the time. There's no sense of personal space, right? If I leave the space to take some personal space, in my room, my mom will be like, "Are you okay? Is something wrong?" And I'm like, "No, I just want my own space right now." But there's no concept of that in a communal space, right? Because we are together as one unit all the time. So there's an honoring of community and how that looks in terms of how you interact with others. Whereas in private spaces, again, more closed door, more perhaps private with information as well. So it depends on what you're sharing out and the information that you're giving to others, and less of that community aspect because you're spending time on your own. And so something that I think about is the fact that my parents don't understand alone time, but I am someone who I've come to love alone time, right? Especially when we are in large group gatherings. And so having to negotiate alone time is so interesting for them because they're like, why would you want to be alone? You're with us, you're together, we are together right now. And so those are ways that private or communal spaces might look both in a time sense, but also in a physical sense. And I don't know, Emily, if you wanted to add anything else to that description as well.
I feel like in your description, you just helped me understand part of my relationship with my partner. So for the folks online, I find myself in a multicultural relationship. And so we're always learning about each other, what some of the differences and how we were raised. And sometimes I'll be like, I just need some space. And they're like, you don't need space. Like, where are you? What's wrong? And so that was so helpful, Susan. Thank
Yes, yeah.
you.
So
Yeah.
private versus communal cultures right there.
I think it's also indicative sometimes of the environments in which we grow up and why the culture is the way it is too, right? So when you think about the history and the context of how the US was settled, and we could go historically into that a lot, but there was this expansiveness and stake your claim on the ground that is your space. And so it's this is my private space, this is my territory, and there's these delineated lines of indicated property, like right, our property space, maybe big houses for only a few people, whereas in other parts of the world, that space is not possible, right? There might be more folks, and so multi-generational living is a product of space and access to some of that. And so the beauties, the joys and challenges that can come with both of those, right? Fewer community, fewer access to resources and people to help out, right? And those more private space considerations, whereas communal space, you're maybe crawling all over each other and not having a lot of space, but you have that community and resources to be able to support each other. So you start to see how these weave together in some of the things that we had talked about before, of, collectivism and individualism and things of that nature. So just a highlight.
Awesome. Thank you.
So if you haven't yet, we'd like to spend a couple of quiet minutes and invite you to go back to that worksheet. We've talked through 5 different components of, or 5 different patterns of culture. And so if you haven't yet, just take a moment to put that X or put a check mark or indicate in some way what that looks like for you individually, right? You personally. Because in a moment, no, this is your part, but I just want just take a minute to look at the handout, and for yourself, reflect on that. This is a good time also if you have any questions about anything that we shared, or curiosities, maybe pushback, feedback, or insights to share. We'd love those in the chat also. We should also note that on page 2, you can type out some notes about what you're learning or what insights come to mind too. So whenever you're ready, I did put the joining instructions back up too.
Okay, so hopefully folks have had a chance to chart on your own. Feel free to join the Mentimeter. Again, you can either use the QR code that's there or use the website and the numerical code on top. And there should be a place for you to chart where you are on the spectrum for each of these different cultural patterns. And so on the left-hand side will be the word that is on the left, and for the right-hand side, that'll be the word that is on the right. And so, for example, for individualism versus collectivism, if you are more individualist in your navigating of the world, you might put yourself on the more left-hand side of the spectrum, versus collectivism would be more right-hand side. And of course, as we mentioned, you can fall anywhere in the middle of that and perhaps orient towards one than the other. It's very fun to see all the different shifts and changes as folks are adding their answers. How are we doing on responses, Emily?
We've got 5 of 29, so it does take a little bit of time for folks to move that slider on their own. And so I think I anticipate us seeing it shift and change for a few more times.
Perfect.
Wait just a couple more seconds.
As you're doing that, I'm going to also include in the chat the descriptions of cultural patterns. I hope that this opens and I did not break anything. But it should have actually all 8 of the cultural patterns that we first showed on the screen. So you can feel free to read through those. And again, if you feel invited with curiosity, you can also Google for more information as well. And you might also, again, find and surface other cultural patterns that we didn't talk about today.
We've got some good participation and noting that, and I love Mentimeter also because you can see, as we look through each one of these scales, where folks are falling. And we definitely have a broad range with, yes, the 3.4 average, but what is more notable is the range that we have present in the room of individualism, and none that are like up all the way, but a few who are really feeling they're representative of their culture as being collectivism. And so recognizing what some of those conversations or communications might be, and how we understand each other, right? Wow. Are you seeing that next one?
Yes. What a distribution.
Mhm. So I think one of the ways, because always we want to think about where you're feeling a smoothness and where it feels really, quote, natural or easy. It's super smooth, versus where you might bump up against, or where it's a little crunchier. These are some adjectives that are just a little it's a little harder to navigate, where there might be some cultural bumps, and power distance might be one, right? So I might want to walk right into an office and go directly to the person that I want to speak to, and they might have an administrative assistant and then also a student at the front desk, and that's 2 levels that I need to navigate through before I can get to the person that I need to speak to, right? And so orienting towards that, and the cultural understandings, those are all different behavioral patterns of what we might come up against or encounter in these different spaces. Same with low and high context. Again, that distribution. So not assuming that it's, the similar people all around, wanting to really create the space that we are more than our patterns, and a mix up of all of them. Looking at the time, schedule, and fluid, noting the more structured and like 4 on that side of it, with very few at the more fluid or relational oriented ones, and still represented, right? And then that space and private and communal, again, that distribution, that representation is great to see.
Yeah. I also just want to name that we had, I think, 9 participants on the Mentimeter. So what's represented is 9 individuals. We have 13 on the call right now. We think our max was 22 today. And so you think of just the wide spectrum of individuals and even each of these different cultural patterns. Then you think of the fact that CSU has, I think, what is it, like 30,000 students, both undergraduate and graduate related. And so just imagine how many different orientations there might be and cultural patterns we might experience and ways that we have to understand cultural patterns more so that we can have a more cohesive way of working together. Awesome.
I was just noting that we're helping being facilitated on the other end of this call. I
Yeah.
just like noting these cultural things that happen. And so we got a note that there's about 15 minutes left. And so that was a good communicated way to say we are scheduled and for us to note how we'll end up and wrap up this training. So I'll go on to the next slide for us. So again, we created this thinking we might be on site and are so grateful for the participation that has been here. And so as you're thinking about for yourself, what is an area, if applicable, that you flow with the culture of CSU? Since you've been here, whether that be 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years, 2 decades, what is a place that feels really easy to navigate? Something that might just be obvious to you, right? I'm thinking of some examples as I'm knowing. Susan, does something come up for you when you look at what an area of flow might be?
It could be for some folks, the flow of a curriculum, right? If folks might be in areas where they're used to a lot of exams, right? A lot of written exams with like fill in the blank, things of that nature. And that's how your education system was when you were younger. You might be more in tune with that and feel more okay with that versus if you were then put into a classroom space where the teacher may be like, oh, there's open selection of assignments. Perhaps you're creating a mixed media project, right? And that might not be an area that you're more familiar with. You might be like, oh no, what do I do and how do I succeed, right? And so it could be that your class curriculum is one that you flow with based on the culture of your education system.
Love that one. Yeah. I would love to see just maybe 1 or 2 examples in the chat. Thinking to yourself where you might find flow in the culture of CSU.
We can also let students unmute themselves if they would like. So if you raise your hand, we can do that.
That's great. Yeah. I would love a bold, that feels a little risky, and I'm hoping that someone will lean into the risk of it. That would be really great. I think a cultural consideration also is different cultures' comfort with silence. I am not of the strong comfort with silence, I'm noticing. So it might be okay, right? So in my vein of not wanting to embarrass or call anyone out or save face, however you are engaging, you've been doing great on the Mentimeter. And so we'll invite this reflection and consideration for you to ensure that we are able to get to the last part of the training that we have prepped. Because where you find a bump up against the culture of CSU, those might be more present, right? Those might be more obvious in terms of where you're curious about why this would happen or be the way, or why on the title of our document it says handout, but there's no hand, or it's a hand. What do you mean it's a handout, right? So even just the jargon or the language, and coming to understand some of that and how we find it. So we'll move on now with some of the tips and tricks that we have. So we will wrap up today. Does that feel okay, Susan?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Great. So some reminders of cross-cultural understanding. We want you to remember that each person's frame of reference or mindset is valid for them and deeply held. So if Susan shared the part about taking her shoes off in the house, and I said, that's really weird. Why do you do that? That perceived judgment that could come, like that's really deeply held, just as deeply held as my practices around what respect of home and making yourself comfortable, or whatever that means and looks like to you is, right? So each person's frame is deeply held, and we're not out in this presentation or others to change anyone's mind or perspective or culture. Really understanding that it's deeply held, it's been crafted and informed over long periods of time. Asking yourself, what dimensions of culture are likely influencing the other person, and what might be influencing you? So anytime that you pay attention within yourself, or you track, that's a word that we use, you kind of track and pay attention, like maybe an angst or a frustration, that might be an aspect of culture that's being bumped up against, right? That might be a norm that exists that you might not be familiar with, and you might need some either different understanding or an invitation to ask some questions and maybe push back against some of it, right? But asking yourself what dimensions of culture might be going on for the other person and what might be going on for you. And remembering that the goal is not to win, but to understand each other. The crux of intercultural competence is that ability to build bridges and to work cross-culturally. It's not to change the mind of other people. It's not to win or say whose culture is better or worse, but it's the ability to move smoothly and adapt to the environments where you can do it together. So those are just some these reminders about cross-cultural understanding.
We did want to give you a tool that you can use. And so, if Emily, you go to the next slide, we have what is called the DIE model. May not look or sound pleasant, but it's very helpful. And so, as we've talked about today, cultural patterns can shift and change over time, right? And you, even with knowing cultural patterns and where different groups might be affiliated with different cultural patterns, we still can't make assumptions as we're walking into spaces about how someone might behave. And so the DIE model is helpful because it's talking about describing, interpreting, and then evaluating so that you can make the most informed decision as you're having interactions with folks from different cultures. So with describing, it's objective analysis and articulation based on observation. So that's when you're trying to gather information. It's really what you see and observe, right? And so when you're talking about what you see and observe, you're not adding any judgment to that. It's really just I'm noticing that that person has a smile on their face. I don't know why they have a smile on their face, right? But I'm just seeing that they have a smile on their face. And then you go into the interpretation phase where that is more subjective analysis and articulation based on a large part of the individual culture or personal opinions or cultural experiences. This is when you're starting to process the information that you're observing. And so this is now what I think I see or what I think I'm observing. And so if I'm encountering someone with a smile, perhaps they're holding flowers in their hand. And I'm like, oh, maybe they're smiling because the flowers make them happy, right? And so that could be an example of the interpretation of that. And then the evaluation aspect is assigning assignment of value judgment based on descriptive and interpretive information, determination stage. And so what you think and or feel about what you think you see or observe. And so I might look at someone who's holding flowers in their hand, smiling about the flowers, and I might be like, wow, that brings me joy, right? I'm experiencing somebody's joy by observing their joy. And so now I'm happy too, right? And so there's a lot of different ways that there can be more cultural examples of this. I gave a very simplified one, but the description, interpretation, and evaluation is very helpful in understanding ways that you're entering relationships and conversations with folks from different cultural backgrounds. Emily, anything you'd like to add or offer for that?
Well, I think it's great. Just like anything, it's a skill that's going to be practiced, right? So taking a breath and taking a pause to really do that translation of sorts is going to take practice like anything else. And so instead of seeing something and jumping to that evaluation and interpretation, taking that pause, noting what is being seen. What am I thinking about that? And then what do I evaluate or how might I respond because of that? That takes some time and it can then be done very quickly, right? So no, I thought you described it great.
Thank you. Just some other tips for improving communication with multicultural audiences. Using simple language. Again, it's not because we don't think that someone has the intelligence, but because there's different vocabulary that we might use. And it's important to think about where that vocabulary piece might confuse somebody in conversation. Learn phrases in different languages. That invites culture sharing, which is really great, and also invites folks to also share their language and culture with you. I am terrible at this because I'm from the East Coast and we talk very fast on the East Coast, so that's my cultural context, but speak slowly and enunciate clearly when you're able to. Observe eye messages. Emily gave some great examples of, sometimes gestures or eye glances or eye contact can signal many different things, and so observing those eye messages is important. Encouraging accurate feedback. This might be for the low context folks, right? Being more direct in that feedback piece. Checking frequently for comprehension. So we did have someone ask earlier about what if I'm not understanding someone's meaning? Definitely checking for comprehension and framing that as your curiosity to learn more. Accepting responsibility and blame. If there are situations where sometimes that miscommunication can cause someone to feel poorly about themselves in that moment, and they express that to you, accept responsibility, even if your intention was not to create any harm in that space. You still have to own that intention, own the impact of that action. Listen without interrupting, and then also follow up in writing. Sometimes written communication can help clarify pieces of verbal communication as well.
Especially when you are working with a team that is comprised of many people, we can all be in the same and hear the same thing. And what we actually heard was quite different. And so when you follow up in writing about what the agreements might be or the expectations, especially if you are in a work context or an academic context, that can be really helpful in multitude of ways communicating the messages. So we're wrapping up. And so when you are considering and thinking about the content that we talked about today, we hope you will consider for yourself what your commitment to this work might be. For some of you, you might be, I'm forced into this. I'm dropped into a culture that is full of many smaller cultures that I'm trying to navigate. I have no option but to, navigate this and figure this out. And it also takes commitment to engage with it meaningfully and think about it and slow down a process or engage in curiosity and build those relationships. It takes courage to do that, right? The courage it takes to leave a place considered home. We saw the many miles that some folks traveled to be with us here today. And because it's virtual, you might be somewhere else taking this training also. And so thinking about where you are and how that informs, but recognizing that it's courageous to even be in this training and to be thinking about this for yourself. And then what your capacity is for this. Sometimes when we are very stressed, sometimes when there is a lot going on or there are factors that are uncontrollable in our lives, we might not act our best self or be able to slow down. And I know for me, when I am most stressed, I go to my cultural defaults, right? I go to what feels safe, what feels most familiar, and feels most comfortable. And that might not always be the most interculturally competent. And so, in those times that you have more capacity to stay at this training until the full end of it, or the capacity to meet that new friend or ask that question, that's the capacity building that's going to encourage that commitment to display that courage towards intercultural competence. So we're just so glad that you've been here with us today.
As we close out, I want to emphasize something that Emily shared at the very beginning of this workshop is that this is an ongoing journey, right? There's not going to be a perfect time where you just say, I've learned everything about every single cultural pattern and now I'm an expert at what I do, right? Because cultures are continuing to shift and evolve over time, this will take a lot of practice. And Emily and I, like she shared, we're still learning and trying to navigate different cultural contexts all the time. And so don't feel like you can't do it or that it's impossible. It just takes a lot of patience for yourself. And so I hope that you give yourself some grace and some patience as you're navigating through, because it takes a lot of work to be able to navigate different cultural contexts.
We're gonna put one final resource in the chat. If you're interested, if you find yourself curious or wanting to learn more or looking at the handout that Susan created and those other components that we didn't get the chance to talk about, that website brings you to a country comparison tool that has been researched across the world. And so if you're curious about what your country of origin might be like in comparison to others, again, it's not the only way, but there are some trends in it. It's another way that you can dig a little deeper into some of what we talked about today.
Well, Susan, Emily, thank you so much. I'm going to use the DIE here, and basically the presentation was fantastic. So thank you very much. I can tell it's my interpretation that you're extremely passionate about this, and it comes through as you present. So I just want to let you know from an evaluation standpoint, you did just a fantastic job. And for those people, those students that have attended and stayed the whole time, I think even if you attended 3/4 of the time or half the time, there's so much that you can glean from this information. And so it was just wonderful. And you both just did a fantastic job. Thank you so much for being willing to come and present to our international students. It was extremely enjoyable. So thank you.
Absolutely.
One final announcement before, and then I'll let you both kind of, if there's anything that you want to say at the very end here, but just want to give a quick reminder. Next week, October 7th, we have our final International Rams Campus Kickoff Session, which is the basics of budgeting. And so FMBO will actually come and present, and it's actually going to be a great presentation as well, just to help prepare you for those students who this is the first time you find yourself on your own budgeting and kind of trying to manage money and that kind of thing. And so they are going to provide the basics of budgeting next week to finish up our sessions. So, and with that, any final thoughts or words of encouragement, Susan and Emily?
I would just say that I think I can speak for both of us when we want to be a cultural resource for you. So please take down our names, find us on Teams, send us an email, get our contact information. And one of our just favorite things is to communicate with students about that intercultural relationship building and being able to drain that iceberg, right? Make more of the implicit explicit in what you might be experiencing and having some of those conversations. So really grateful for today and hope it's just a foundation that we can build off of. Susan?
Nope, echoing everything that you said. And if there are any questions that surface after this, feel free to pass them upward and through to us. And we're happy to try to brainstorm with you and learn with you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you once again. And students, thanks for attending and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.